The quiet of the night was broken only by the hum of distant machines as Daniel lay in his bed, staring at the metallic ceiling of his dorm room. Life at the intergalactic exchange program had been anything but ordinary since he arrived on the alien planet, Zephyros. It had been a month since the program began, and despite the incredible opportunity to study alongside extraterrestrial species, the cultural differences were becoming more of a challenge than Daniel anticipated. His alien classmates were intriguing, yet their customs, especially their telepathic abilities, often left him feeling like an outsider. Daniel's roommate, Leora, was from the Crenarian species, tall, with shimmering silver skin that glowed faintly in the dark. Her soft, musical voice and sharp intellect had made their initial encounters pleasant, though still a bit awkward. Like most Crenarians, she was empathetic and in tune with the emotions of others, something that constantly kept Daniel on edge. One evening, Daniel had just stepped out of the shower, the towel loosely draped around his waist, when his dormitory door slid open without warning. His heart leaped into his throat as Leora stood in the doorway, her glowing eyes widening at the sight before her. Daniel froze, fumbling to tighten the towel around his waist, the shock of the moment sinking in. "Leora," Daniel gasped, trying to steady his breathing. "I thought you were at class." Leora blinked, her usually calm demeanor shaken. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice unusually soft and full of confusion. The air between them hung heavy with awkwardness. Daniel's face flushed as he noticed her staring not just at him, but seemingly analyzing him, as if trying to understand something deeper. In that moment, Daniel was painfully aware of the physical and emotional distance between them, not just in species but in understanding. Humans weren't telepathic, and he couldn't read what Leora was feeling. After what felt like an eternity, Leora quickly turned and left the room, the door hissing closed behind her. Daniel stood frozen for a few more moments, replaying the bizarre encounter in his mind. What did she think of him now? Had he just crossed some unknown alien boundary? As he slumped onto his bed, still in his towel, Daniel groaned. Tomorrow was sure to be full of more awkward encounters. The next morning, Daniel awoke with the awkward memory still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the embarrassment, and every time he thought about it, his stomach twisted in knots. What was Leora thinking? Would she tell others? The thought of being the subject of alien gossip made him cringe. As he got dressed, he tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept wandering back to the incident. Making his way to the dining hall for breakfast, Daniel felt unusually self-conscious. He could feel the stares of other students, alien and human alike, though he knew it was probably all in his head. The Intergalactic Academy on Zephyros was home to many species, each with its own quirks and cultures. But as the only human in his class, Daniel often felt like a spectacle, and last night's event had only made that feeling worse. As he grabbed a tray of food and scanned the room for an empty seat, he spotted Leora sitting at a table with a few other Crenarian students. His heart skipped a beat. She glanced up at him, their eyes locking for a brief moment before she quickly looked away, her expression unreadable. The moment passed, but the tension between them was undeniable. Should he approach her? Should he try to clear the air, or would that only make things worse? Daniel took a deep breath and decided to avoid confrontation for now. He found an empty seat at the far end of the dining hall and sat down, poking at his food without much enthusiasm. His mind raced with possible outcomes of his next interaction with Leora. He imagined her being cold and distant, or worse, bringing up the awkward incident in front of their classmates. He wasn't sure if Crenarians even experienced embarrassment the way humans did. After breakfast, Daniel headed to his first class, an interspecies communication lecture. It was one of his favorite subjects because it explored the intricacies of communicating across different species languages, body languages, and even telepathic abilities. Today, however, he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Leora and the awkwardness that now hung between them like a thick cloud. As class ended, Daniel gathered his things and headed toward the door, still lost in thought. He didn't notice Leora until she was standing right in front of him, blocking his path. Startled, he stopped abruptly, nearly dropping his notebook. "Daniel," Leora said softly, her voice carrying an air of uncertainty. "Can we talk?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Yeah, sure," he replied, his voice betraying his nerves. They walked in silence for a few moments before Leora led him to a quiet corner of the hallway. She seemed hesitant, her usual calm and collected demeanor slightly frayed. Daniel's mind raced, unsure of what to expect. "I wanted to apologize for last night," Leora began, her glowing eyes focusing intently on him. "I didn't mean to intrude like that. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was distracted." Daniel was caught off guard by her apology. No, it's okay," he said quickly. "I should have locked the door or something. I didn't expect anyone to come in." There was a pause, and for a moment, they both seemed unsure of how to move forward. Leora shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I think," Leora started slowly, "think we need to understand each other better. Humans and Crenarians are so different. Last night, I saw something in you. Kind of vulnerability that we don't often express in my species. It's strange to me, but I want to understand it." Daniel blinked, not sure how to respond. He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. Vulnerability. "I don't know about that. It was just an awkward moment." Leora tilted her head, her glowing eyes studying him closely. "It wasn't just awkwardness. I could feel your emotions, Daniel. We Crenarians are sensitive to that. You were embarrassed, but also something else. It's hard to explain, but I felt it deeply." Daniel was silent for a moment, digesting her words. He had always known that Leora and her species could sense emotions, but hearing her describe his feelings like that made him uncomfortable. It was as if she could see inside him, in ways that humans couldn't even begin to imagine. "I guess we humans aren't used to being that open with our emotions," Daniel admitted, feeling a bit exposed. "We're taught to keep a lot of things to ourselves." Leora nodded thoughtfully. "That's something I've noticed. You contain your emotions, even when they're strong. It's intriguing." There was another pause, but this time it wasn't filled with the same tension as before. Instead, there was a sense of mutual curiosity, bridge beginning to form between them. "Maybe we both have a lot to learn from each other," Daniel said with a small smile. "I mean, that's kind of the point of this exchange program, right?" Leora returned the smile, her previous awkwardness fading. "Yes, I suppose it is. And perhaps last night was just the beginning of that learning process." The awkwardness between Daniel and Leora seemed to dissipate after their conversation. Though the memory of their embarrassing encounter still lingered, it had shifted from a source of tension to one of shared understanding. Over the next few days, their interactions became more relaxed, though there was still a lingering curiosity in the air, as if both were still trying to figure out where they stood in each other's lives. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself spending more time with Leora, both in and out of class. Her insights into Crenarian culture fascinated him, and she seemed equally intrigued by his human perspective. They often found themselves staying late after classes, discussing not only academic subjects but also deeper topics like emotions, beliefs, and the differences between their species. One afternoon, while walking back from the academy, Leora broke the comfortable silence between them. "Do you ever wonder what we could learn from each other if we didn't have all these boundaries?" she asked, her voice contemplative. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Boundaries? You mean between humans and Crenarians?" Leora nodded, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yes, but also boundaries we put up around ourselves. You said once that humans are taught to keep emotions inside. It makes me wonder how much we miss out on by not sharing those feelings openly. Daniel thought about that for a moment. It was true. Humans, at least in his culture, were often taught to guard their emotions, to hide vulnerability and keep a strong front. But now, standing next to Leora, with her species' emphasis on emotional transparency, he began to question whether those walls were really necessary. I don't know, Daniel said after a pause. I think it's just the way we've learned to cope. It's a form of protection. If you don't show your emotions, people can't hurt you with them. Leora stopped walking and turned to face him. But doesn't that mean you also cut yourself off from deeper connections, from understanding others fully? Daniel met her gaze, surprised by the depth of her question. He hadn't really thought about it that way before. Could it be that humans, in their desire to protect themselves, were also isolating themselves from meaningful relationships? I guess you're right, he admitted slowly. We do miss out on that sometimes. They continued walking, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in their relationship. It wasn't just about understanding each other's cultures anymore. It was about something deeper, something that connected them as individuals, beyond species or societal norms. As they approached their dormitory, Leora stopped again, this time with a more serious expression on her face. Daniel, I've been thinking about something, she said carefully, as if choosing her words. There's something different about you, not just because you're human, but something more. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Different how? Laura hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering slightly. It's hard to explain. I feel something when I'm around you, something that I don't feel with other humans or even Crenarians. It's like your emotions are strong, but you keep them locked away. It's as if there's a storm inside you, but you won't let it out. Daniel stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The idea of someone sensing emotions that he wasn't even fully aware of was unsettling. What was it that she felt? And why was he so hesitant to let her, or anyone, see it? I don't know what to say, Daniel said quietly. Maybe it's just fear. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of being misunderstood. Lyra's expression softened. I don't think you have to be afraid with me, Daniel. Want to understand you. I want to know what's behind that storm. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel had always been cautious about letting people in, but something about Leora made him feel like he didn't need to hide. Maybe it was her openness, her ability to sense emotions without judgment. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone genuinely wanted to understand him. I guess I'm not used to being that open, Daniel said slowly. But maybe you're right. Maybe I don't need to be afraid with you. Laura smiled. A small but genuine smile that made her eyes glow even brighter. I'm glad you feel that way. They stood in silence for a few more moments, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. It wasn't just a friendship anymore. It was something more profound, a bond that transcended their differences in species and culture. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a weight lifting off his chest. Maybe this strange intergalactic exchange program wasn't just about learning from aliens. Maybe it was about discovering something deeper about himself, about vulnerability, connection, and the strength that came from sharing those parts of himself that he had always kept hidden. For the first time since arriving on Zephyros, Daniel didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he belonged. As the days passed, Daniel and Laura grew even closer, their conversations ranging from light-hearted banter to deep philosophical discussions. It was clear that something special was forming between them, a connection that neither of them fully understood but both were eager to explore. But with this growing closeness came a new tension, something unspoken that lingered just beneath the surface. One evening, as they sat together in the Academy's garden, The air between them seemed heavier than usual. The two moons of Zephyros hung low in the sky, casting a soft, bluish glow over the landscape. The scent of alien flowers filled the air, and the faint sounds of distant wildlife echoed in the night. It was a serene moment, but Daniel could feel that something was bothering Lyra. "You've been quiet tonight," Daniel remarked, breaking the silence. Lyra looked up at him, her silver skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. She hesitated for a moment, as if she was wrestling with something inside. "I've been thinking," she said slowly. "There's something I haven't told you. Something about Crenarians, and about me." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't expected this conversation to take such a serious turn. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Laura took a deep breath, her glowing eyes reflecting the light of the moons. "Crenarians. We don't just sense emotions. We can influence them, too." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "You can? What?" "We can guide emotions," Leora explained, her voice soft but steady. "Not control them, exactly, but nudge them in certain directions. It's a deeply ingrained part of our biology. One of the reasons we're so in tune with others. But it's something we're taught to use with great caution. It's why we value transparency and openness so much. We believe that emotions should be shared honestly, without manipulation." Daniel stared at her, unsure of how to process this revelation. He had known that Crenarians were empathetic, but this was something entirely different. The idea that Leora, or any Crenarian, could subtly influence his feelings left him feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. "Have you done that to me?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. "No, never," she said firmly. "I would never do that to you, Daniel. I respect you too much, but I wanted to tell you the truth because I want to be completely honest with you. I don't want there to be any secrets between us." Daniel's mind was racing. He wanted to believe her, and a part of him did. But another part of him, one that had been raised to keep emotions guarded, was now questioning everything. How could he be sure that his feelings were truly his own? How could he know that the bond he felt with Leora wasn't somehow influenced by her abilities? "I appreciate you telling me," Daniel said, his voice cautious. "But how can I know for sure? How can I be sure that what I'm feeling is real?" Laura's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost sad. "I can't give you proof," she admitted. "All I can do is ask you to trust me. Trust that I haven't used my abilities on you. I've been careful, Daniel, because I care about you. I didn't want this to come between us." The vulnerability in her voice cut through Daniel's doubts. He could see that this wasn't easy for her, that admitting this secret took courage. And despite the fear and uncertainty swirling in his mind, he wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her. "I do trust you," Daniel said, surprising even himself with the words. "It's just a lot to take in." Laura nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know. And I don't expect you to be okay with it right away. But I wanted you to know the truth, because you deserve that." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Daniel's mind was still reeling from the revelation, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief. Leora had been honest with him, completely open in a way that most humans never were. She hadn't tried to hide her abilities or manipulate the situation. She had laid it all out for him, trusting that he would understand. After a long pause, Daniel spoke again. "I'm glad you told me," he said quietly. "And I want to keep learning. About you. About Crenarians. About this whole experience. It's a lot, but I think we're both figuring it out as we go." Laura smiled, and the tension that had filled the air earlier seemed to lift. "That's all I could ask for," she said softly. As they sat together under the light of the moons, The bond between them felt stronger than ever. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real, and that was something Daniel could hold on to. For the first time since their awkward encounter weeks ago, Daniel felt like he truly understood Leora, and maybe even himself, a little better. They still had a lot to learn about each other, and there were sure to be more obstacles ahead. But for now, they had something real, something worth fighting for. The days that followed were marked by a subtle shift in the dynamic between Daniel and Leora. While they continued to grow closer, the weight of Leora's revelation lingered in the background, casting a shadow over their interactions. Daniel couldn't help but wonder how much of their connection was influenced by Leora's abilities. He trusted her, but the doubt remained, gnawing at the back of his mind. One evening, while they were sitting in the Academy's lounge, Leora broke the silence with a question that caught Daniel off guard. "Do you ever think about going home?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Daniel looked up from the tablet he had been reading. "Home? You mean Earth?" Leora nodded, her glowing eyes studying him closely. "Yes, you talk about it sometimes, but I've never asked how you feel about being here, so far away from everything you know." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. It was a question he had asked himself many times since arriving on Zephyros. At first, the excitement of the intergalactic exchange program had overshadowed any feelings of homesickness. But as time passed, he began to miss the familiar sights and sounds of Earth, the smell of rain, the feel of the wind, the way the stars looked in the night sky. Zephyros was beautiful, but it wasn't home. "I think about it a lot," Daniel admitted. "I miss my family, my friends. Sometimes I wonder what they're doing, if they miss me too. But at the same time, being here, it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I'm learning so much, not just about aliens, but about myself." Leora listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "I understand. I feel the same way about my home. Even though I've grown up with the idea of interspecies exchange, it's still strange to be away from everything I know." Daniel nodded, appreciating her openness. He knew that Crenarians weren't as private about their feelings as humans, but Leora had always been careful about what she shared, especially when it came to personal topics. This moment of vulnerability felt important. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. Leora paused, considering his question. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it, but it's been harder than I expected. I thought I understood humans, but being here with you, it's shown me that there's so much more I don't know. It's challenging, but it's also exciting." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, I feel the same way. It's hard being the only human sometimes. I feel like everyone's watching me, waiting for me to mess up." Leora's eyes softened. "You've handled it well, though. Admire how resilient you are. Even when things get difficult, you keep pushing forward. That's not something all species can do." Daniel felt a warmth in his chest at her words. It was one thing to be complimented by another human, but to hear it from Leora, a member of a species that valued emotional transparency and connection, meant something more. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded, letting the silence between them settle into something comfortable. For the next few days, Daniel found himself thinking more and more about home. He had always known that his time on Zephyros was limited, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Eventually, he would have to return to Earth, and the thought of leaving Leora behind filled him with a sense of unease. Their connection had grown deeper, and while they hadn't spoken about it explicitly, Daniel knew that what they shared was more than just friendship. One evening, after a particularly long day of classes, Daniel returned to his dorm room to find Leora waiting for him. She was sitting on the edge of his bed, her expression serious. "Daniel," she began, "there's something I need to tell you. Something important." Daniel felt his heart rate quicken. He had no idea what was coming, but the intensity in her voice made him nervous. "What is it?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Laura hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. There's a reason why I've been so interested in human emotions. Why I've been spending so much time with you. Daniel frowned, confused. What do you mean? Laura took a deep breath, her glowing eyes meeting his. I wasn't entirely honest with you before. Crenarians don't just sense emotions. We can also absorb them. Daniel blinked, stunned by her words. Absorb them? What do you mean? Laura looked down, her voice filled with regret. When we're close to someone, physically and emotionally, we can take in their feelings. It's a way for us to understand other species, to connect with them on a deeper level. But it's also dangerous. If we absorb too much, it can overwhelm us. Daniel's mind was racing. He hadn't expected this. So, have you been absorbing my emotions this whole time? Laura shook her head, not intentionally. I've been careful not to let it happen, but the more time we spend together, the harder it is to control. That's why I wanted to tell you. I didn't want to keep this from you any longer. Daniel felt a mixture of emotions, shock, confusion, and a strange sense of betrayal. He trusted Laura, but this revelation made him question everything. How much of what they shared was real? How much of it was influenced by her abilities? I don't know what to say, Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura looked up at him, her eyes filled with sadness. I understand if you're angry. I should have told you sooner, but please believe me when I say that I care about you, Daniel. This connection we have, it's real. I haven't used my abilities on you, but I couldn't keep this secret any longer. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to process everything. He wanted to be angry, but looking into Laura's eyes, he couldn't find it in himself to blame her. She had been honest, even when it was difficult. And despite the shock of her revelation, he knew that their bond was real. I believe you, Daniel said finally, but we need to figure this out, together. Laura smiled, a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Daniel. I want to figure it out too. In the days following Laura's revelation, Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. While he appreciated her honesty, knowing that she could absorb his emotions complicated their relationship in ways he hadn't anticipated. They still spent time together, but there was an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore. Daniel found himself hyper-aware of his own feelings, wondering how much of what he was experiencing was his and how much Laura might be absorbing. He was afraid that, if he let himself get too close to her, she would be overwhelmed by the intensity of his emotions. It made every interaction feel like a delicate balancing act, and it was exhausting. One evening, after a long day of classes, Daniel decided to confront the growing dilemma head-on. He found Laura in the Academy's meditation garden, sitting quietly among the alien flora. The air was thick with the scent of strange flowers, and the two moons of Zephyros cast a soft blue light over the scene. Laura looked peaceful, but Daniel knew that she was likely sensing his internal conflict before he even spoke. Laura, we need to talk, Daniel said, his voice firm but gentle. She looked up at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the light of the moons. I know, she replied softly, as if she had been expecting this. Daniel sat down beside her, taking a deep breath before speaking. I don't know how to move forward. I care about you, more than I've ever cared about anyone. But I'm scared. I don't want to hurt you. Laura turned to face him, her expression serious. You won't hurt me, Daniel. I can handle this. I have trained for years to control my abilities. I wouldn't let myself be overwhelmed. Daniel shook his head. But what if I'm too much? What if my emotions are too intense for you to handle? I don't want to put you in danger. Laura reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. Daniel, I've chosen to be here with you. I've chosen to feel what you feel, to understand you, I don't regret that choice." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Daniel felt the tension ease slightly, but the fear still lingered. "But what if it gets worse?" Daniel asked quietly. "What if we get closer, and it becomes too much?" Laura's eyes softened, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. "We'll face it together. We'll figure it out. I don't want to lose what we have because of fear." Her words struck a chord in Daniel. He had been so focused on the potential danger that he hadn't allowed himself to fully embrace the connection they shared. Despite the risks, he realized that he didn't want to let go of what they had. It was rare, and it was real. "You're right," Daniel said, his voice steadying. "I don't want to lose this either." Laura smiled, and the tension that had been building between them seemed to dissolve. For the first time in days, Daniel felt a sense of clarity. He still had doubts, but he knew that he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. As the night wore on, they sat in the garden, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to move forward without the weight of secrets or fear holding them back. And for the first time, Daniel truly believed that they could make it work, despite the odds. Weeks passed, and life at the Intergalactic Academy began to fall into a comfortable rhythm for Daniel and Laura. They had found a balance, a way to navigate the complexities of their relationship while still respecting the boundaries of their respective species. Laura continued to be cautious with her abilities, and Daniel made an effort to be more open about his emotions, trusting her with parts of himself that he had never shared with anyone before. Their bond grew stronger, but as their relationship deepened, so did the looming reality that Daniel's time on Zephyros was limited. The exchange program would end in a few months, and eventually he would have to return to Earth. It was a thought that Daniel tried to push to the back of his mind, but it became harder to ignore as the days passed. One evening, as they sat together in Daniel's dorm room, the topic of his departure came up for the first time. "So, what happens when you leave?" Laura asked, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel's heart sank at the question. It was something he had been avoiding, but he knew they couldn't ignore it forever. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've thought about it, but I don't have any answers." Laura looked down, her expression thoughtful. "I don't want you to leave," she said softly. "I don't want to leave either," Daniel replied, his voice filled with emotion. "But I don't know if I have a choice. Earth is my home." Laura nodded, her glowing eyes reflecting a sadness that Daniel had rarely seen in her. "I understand," she said quietly, "but it's hard to imagine you not being here." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Daniel felt torn between two worlds, the life he had left behind on Earth and the new life he had built on Zephyros with Laura. The idea of leaving her behind was unbearable, but he knew that his time on this alien planet was temporary. "I've been thinking," Laura said after a long pause. "There might be a way." Daniel looked at her, confused. "A way for what?" "A way for you to stay," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. Daniel blinked, surprised. "Stay? How?" "There are programs, long-term exchange programs between species. It's rare, but it happens. You could apply for one. It would mean staying here for much longer, years maybe. But if you want to, it's possible." Daniel's mind raced at the possibility. Could he really stay? The thought of remaining on Zephyros, with Laura by his side, was tempting. But it also meant leaving behind everything he knew on Earth, his family, his friends, his entire life. "I don't know if I can do that," Daniel said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "It's a huge decision." Laura nodded, her expression understanding. "I know. And I don't want you to feel pressured, but I thought you should know that it's an option." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Daniel felt a swirl of emotions: hope, fear, excitement, and doubt. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Whatever choice he made, it would change his life forever. "I need time to think," Daniel said finally. Laura smiled gently. "Take all the time you need. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." As the night wore on, Daniel found himself lost in thought. The idea of staying on Zephyros, of building a life with Leora, was both thrilling and terrifying. But as he sat there, feeling the warmth of her presence beside him, he realized that sometimes the biggest risks were the ones worth taking.